Welcome to episode 101 of the G2 on 5G. It's the latest inside scoop on everything 5G. We cover 6 topics in about 20 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. I'm Will Townsend, and joining me again this week is Federal Analyst Anshel. Let's get started with my first topic. And news broke this week that Orange and Ericsson are piloting a 5G drone surveillance system in the Port of Vigo, Spain. And I found this to be pretty interesting. Most of the use cases for 5G within ports is more about IoT and control. So the question that came to my mind was, could there be a longer term impact and application for this beyond ports? And I think so. So at a very high level, they are using very high resolution cameras attached to drones to basically monitor whether there are people in unauthorized areas of the port. And this is a beautiful use case for 5G, given 5G's ultra low latency and the ability for it to connect to a control center within the port. And again, depending on the spectrum that they're using, can cover quite a distance. And ports are very, very large operations. So I don't know if you caught this news this week, but I thought it was pretty cool. What do you think?
I did not. However, I have been to the Port of Vigo.
Oh, cool.
And it is an interesting place because I believe it's on the oil-rich northern coast of Spain.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a lot of port traffic there, but I believe the primary business there is actually kind of ingesting and exporting oil. So it's a very wealthy town because of that. So you definitely have the ability to spend the money to make this a possible use case.
Mm-hmm.
But it will be interesting to see what other use cases get deployed in ports outside of just the usual IoT asset tracking kind of scenario. So it's interesting to see that they're going to be using drones for security purposes, obviously in conjunction with humans, but makes it a lot harder to hide from a camera when the camera can move around and detect, hopefully, it has a thermal camera as well. So it would be very interesting to see how that works out.
Yeah, and they're leveraging AI, and a lot of the smart cameras that are available today use artificial intelligence as well for computer vision type applications. This is part of a larger project, which is called the 5G National Plan in Spain. And the program's development purpose is for ensuring 5G technology is piloted, and it's also promoted by the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Digital Transformation in Spain. So I think the applications could extend to large corporate campus environments where you could deploy this sort of solution and eliminate a lot of the foot walking of traditional security people and that sort of thing. But it's super interesting, just another really killer use case from my perspective that highlights the power of 5G. But let's move to your first topic this week. You want to talk about US Cellular.
Yeah, so US Cellular is expected to build out their new midband network. And this is using the $2 billion in spectrum that they paid for in the 3.45 gigahertz band. That was the 100 megahertz auction. And that, they won a considerable amount of that, and they're going to be using that to build out their midband network. And the expectation is that they're going to be using Nokia and Ericsson hardware, which is kind of, standard, expected. The one surprising thing is that Samsung is not included in this build out. And US Cellular has previously used Ericsson's equipment for low band and millimeter wave 5G services.
Mm-hmm.
But Nokia is likely to be part of this 3.45 gigahertz build out with their AirScale products. I don't know how I managed to mess that up. But yeah, it's going to be expected to roll out by the end of this year. Start to roll out by the end of this year and be built out by the end of next year. So it's probably going to be a slower rollout. and they're rolling out their millimeter wave as well. So it's going to be interesting to see how that footprint looks like, because US Cellular is a much smaller operator than the big three.
Yeah.
But there's a possibility that this combined with millimeter wave could potentially offer some very compelling use cases and applications, as well as just overall consumer, experience. So I don't know, what are your thoughts?
Well, we've talked about US Cellular's millimeter wave rollout. I believe is on a couple of podcasts ago. I think this is smart. I'm surprised that Ericsson isn't in the Ericsson is in the mix. I'm surprised that Samsung's not in the mix because they have capabilities in ORAN and VRAN and that sort of thing. I didn't really catch this news, so I'm still getting up to speed on it. But how much is Open RAN a sort of a part of their build out for their midband?
It doesn't really seem like it is.
Okay, that's
I didn't see
interesting.
any mention of Open RAN or ORAN.
That's interesting. Just given, like you mentioned, US Cellular's position, they've been right behind the big, three in the US, and they have, quite a rural footprint. And
Mhm.
so they're going to be challenged from a CapEx perspective in getting those build outs done timely. And, Open RAN could potentially help close the gap there. But
I think in that sense, they also have limited resources
Mhm.
on the OpEx side of maintaining ORAN. So I think that's also a component of it is, they might actually be too small for the headcount necessary to maintain all the software and hardware, being able to actually constantly maintain it instead of do a much more traditional deployment.
That's a good point. Turnkey versus, something that's disaggregated does require a lot more integration, a lot more babysitting. So that's a great insight, my friend. Well, let's move to my second topic this week. I want to talk about Nokia. And they've introduced recently several industrial 5G devices. And so the first question I had before I dug into it was, are they straying outside of their core competency from an infrastructure perspective? And as actually I dug into it, this really comes from Nokia's frustration around a lack of industrial 5G devices. So we've talked about Nokia Enterprise in the past relative to their traditional incumbent competitors. They definitely have a lead within private 5G. They've been focused on it considerably longer than Ericsson and Samsung. But from my perspective, what they've decided to do is partner with Savo or Savix Communications, which is also in Finland. And so it's sort of an OEM. And this isn't new. At Mobile World Congress, there were some routers and push-to-talk radios that are branded Nokia that they were showing in their booth. That sort of supplements what they're doing from a private 5G perspective. So in some of the devices, the new products include an AI latent video camera for various QuickTime industrial analysis, wearable cameras for site surveillance and staff communications. And they also state plus a range of handheld remote speaker microphones, noise canceling, and helmet compatible headsets. So as I dug into it, this is actually smart. Nokia recognized a lack of those industrial 5G devices, partnered with a company that's been doing ruggedized industrial type solutions for quite some time. And I think it's a solid solution. What do you think?
I actually missed this announcement, so I actually don't know that much about it, but I do think it's interesting because it is a little bit outside of their core. But I also think that if they're not the ones that are necessarily building it, that they have a partner who has a little bit more experience building hardware. That's probably the right approach. That said, there were definitely some issues with Nokia's FWA device that they were rolling out on T-Mobile. So it's a possibility that they could run into issues with this hardware as well. So I think Nokia is definitely trying to expand and probably learning a lot of lessons along the way. But as they say, if someone doesn't build it, then maybe you have to. And that sounds like it might be one of those cases where Nokia doesn't see people filling the market fast enough, and for them to be able to sell infrastructure, they need endpoints. So
Yeah.
I think that's kind of what this is really about. I don't really see this being a long-term strategy for them.
Great insights, my friend. Well, let's move to your second topic, and you want to talk about AT&T, and they recently made a statement with respect to their status on deploying 5G standalone, and you wanted to share that with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, so I was reading a article on Fierce Wireless, and it was about AT&T saying that they will activate 5G standalone core when devices are ready. I unfortunately, was not able to get a hold of anyone at AT&T to clarify, but I did reach out. And the interesting part is they actually had Gordon Mansfield speak at a conference called Connect X, which I actually think I was invited to. I wasn't able to attend. And he talked about the fact that it's not their core deployment isn't actually tied to any spectrum or infrastructure, but that that there's an issue with battery life using standalone mode, and when you're on non-standalone, you're using LTE. But basically, he's saying that standalone mode uses more power, and while I haven't really heard that from anyone before, I'm doing some digging. My understanding is there really aren't many applications where standalone uses more power,
Right.
except for if you're using wider bandwidth, which is expected. Maybe if you're in a more passive state, in a standby state, there's a possibility that it could consume more power if you're connected to wider bands. But that wouldn't really be a huge difference, except for the fact that, unless you're just constantly on standby and are expecting days of standby. But the reality is people are mostly using their devices. And I have a feeling that the consumption on standby is fairly low as a percentage of the device's overall power consumption, regardless of whether or not standalone is an increased power. So I'm not really sure if that necessarily tracks with what I understand. It's interesting is I actually kind of agree with some of our colleagues at Del Oro Group, who said, it's more about the midband network and having that built out. And I think that's a much better explanation than the devices aren't ready. Because if you ask any OEM or any other carrier, you don't really hear that as an excuse. So I thought that was a very odd choice, but it's something worth investigating, and I'm going to look into it deeper. But my understanding is it really isn't an issue, and this might be a little bit more of a deflection than anything.
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously part of the 5G New Radio standard provides some improvements in power management for devices on a network. I mean, certainly 5G supports a lot more devices than LTE does, but this is odd to me as well, that AT&T would be stating that it's a power issue, and that it's a lack of device support and that sort of thing. But it's something certainly that we can dig into. We have great relationships, both of us, with AT&T, so we will definitely do that. And maybe by the time we post the podcast, we'll be able to provide some additional color on that. But let me move to my third and final topic this week, and I want to talk about T-Mobile. So they recently announced their private 5G offering, which I've been waiting for quite some time. We've been talking about standalone. They are first to standalone. Standalone unlocks the true promise of 5G from a latency and throughput and performance and device support perspective. And so they did unveil sort of a 3-path to private. They're actually positioning their public network for certain applications, and I'm assuming that could be a slice. They have something called hybrid mobile, which is a combination of their public network and private. Then they have a private mobile network offering as well. And I learned this week that Nokia is a big part of their build out, and they're working with Nokia on the hybrid and on the private modes. And is it a smart move? I think it certainly is. T-Mobile picked the most mature of the traditional infrastructure providers out there in Nokia to help them with private networking. I guess what I'm really looking for is, T-Mobile's invested in the network. They've got the most complete spectrum footprint. They are certainly in a great position to launch private network services with Standalone, but where are the use cases? Where are the applications? So what do you think?
I also saw this announcement, and it kind of came a little under the radar. But I would say that they also announced that they'll be working with Ericsson and Dell Technologies. So this is a 3-company partner announcement, and my understanding is that Ericsson will be providing some of the RAN and core solutions for this 5G advanced network solutions portfolio.
Right.
And I'm not quite sure what Dell is providing, but I assume it's also probably some of the private networking solutions, maybe some open RAN. And I think, giving customers choice might also be a good thing, because maybe not one network vendor can necessarily deliver everything all at once. So I think it's good that they have some opportunity to give people choice. I think they they have these 3 different flavors of public mobile, hybrid mobile, and private mobile.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see how they build that out, and how they tell that story, because it felt like we got a press release and not much else.
Right.
And it'd be great to kind of understand a little better how that gets deployed, and what customers are looking for. And I think there's a lot more that we have yet to learn from T-Mobile on this side, but I feel like this might be more of a teaser announcement than a full-fledged one. So we might be getting more later on.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you mentioned the other partners, because it just wasn't Nokia. I can definitely confirm unequivocally that Dell doesn't necessarily have a private 5G as a service offering, but what they're very focused on is enabling Open RAN. They have this relationship with Mavenir and that offload card. And so, it wasn't specifically stated, but I imagine Dell's a part of sort of that Open RAN build out.
Mm-hmm.
But with that said, let's move to your third and final topic. And you want to talk about the DoD and the CISA releasing a 5G security evaluation process.
Yes. So like many governmental agencies, there are processes and standards and requirements for doing things. And the CISA, which is Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, and the DoD released a 5G security evaluation process investigation study, which means that there is a study they've done that kind of helps different governmental agencies identify whether or not they need a 5G solution to a problem. And I have gone many clicks deep on this. This is actually, the document itself is extremely long. I think it's 44 pages. So I have not gotten through the 44 pages. And this is version 1 published today. So it's very fresh and new. And there are about a dozen authors that are involved in this. And it's talking about 5G and giving like a process of evaluation. It's a 5-step process, and I think that's the depth that I'll go into in terms of talking about this.
Sure.
But the step 1 is to define the federal 5G use case. Then step 2 is to identify the assessment boundary. Step 3 is to identify security requirements. Step 4 is to map security requirements to federal guidance. And step 5 is to assess security guidance gaps and alternatives. So the good thing here is that there's a lot of talk about security, and that security is a critical component of how the government wants agencies to look at 5G. And I think that's really important because we need more security in our infrastructure. And if we're really going to deploy 5G in as many places as it can go, there's going to be a need to kind of deploy security at every level and think security first. There's a flow chart for the 5G system, talking about user equipment, brand, core, MEC, cloud, orchestration, so that this is a very well thought out document. It's also very detailed, and it kind of explains to people the difference between open RAN, private core, private MEC, hybrid, and kind of how an agency can use 5G. It definitely looks like it's very much more focused on security, which makes sense because this is CISA.
Right.
But it's very interesting to see how they've addressed threats and kind of how they look at 5G as a technology for enabling the U.S. government, but also evaluation processes and making sure that the government is using 5G securely.
No, I think it's a great thing. 5G inherently has much better security provisions than LTE, but this is a huge issue. I also cover security for the firm. We talk about it because it intersects with 5G on this podcast. And it's certainly an important thing because 5G is being, like you mentioned, considered for deployment within military applications, but it's also going to be integrated into critical infrastructure management, like energy grid management and that sort of thing. So, and certainly telecommunications is also critical infrastructure. So one of the reasons why the Chinese vendors have been shown the boot in this country. So I think it's a good thing. Threat actors are becoming much more sophisticated. I think the current geopolitical environment has raised the visibility on cybersecurity hacks. I was just reading recently about a GM infiltration. General Motors, one of the largest companies on the planet, they're not immune from this sort of thing as well. I don't think that was 5G related, but cybersecurity is a huge issue. I've talked about on blogs on Forbes and on this podcast about how important, how critical this is. So I think this is a good first step, and I'm sure there'll be much more to do down the road. But with that, I want to thank our listeners and viewers for putting up with my voice quality today. I'm a little horsey, but Anshel, it's been another great podcast. Why don't you take us home?
Absolutely. We hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone out there would like to provide insights on a specific 5G topic for a future podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at Will Town Tech, and I'm at Anshel Saad. We hope you have a great weekend, and please tune in again next week.